speaker. John Lyons is originally from London, England, not from Liverpool, but we won't hold that against him today. He is currently a very proud resident of that neighborhood just to the north of Edgewater, Rogers Park. He is a professor of history, and he teaches at Joliet Junior College. He teaches both U.S. and British history. And I think it's fair to say that the Beatles loom large in both those categories. So,
what role has Chicago played in Beatles history? And the name of the book is Joy and Fear, the Beatles, Chicago in the 1960s. And it's called that because when the Beatles came to Chicago, a lot of people were full of enthusiasm, and they saw the whole experience as a joyful moment in their lives, which they still remember up to today with fondness. But other people feared the Beatles. They worried about the influences that they were bringing to America. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you some stories that tell us a little bit about both of those points of view. Now, I know John and Bob have tuned in because of this last point, and I'm sure many of you have. Do you want to know about the Beatles parting in Edgewater? Yes, you do. And if you do want to know about that, you're going to have to hang on till towards the end of the presentation. Okay, so what is Chicago's contribution to the Beatles story? And the first one, pretty obviously, is the music from Chicago was very influential in Beatles music. And the first person that I've listed there on the screen, Gene Krupa, maybe some of you know him, some don't. He was a big band drummer, a very wild drummer in one of these big band orchestras. And Ringo Starr claimed on a number of occasions that the reason he became a drummer is because of Krupa. He saw him in films and was very inspired. Even though his drumming style is different, he was inspired by the fun that Krupa was having as a drummer. Now, the next two on the list there you're probably familiar with, and that's Chuck Berry and Bo Diddley. And both of them were at the cornerstone of rock and roll. They are the foundations of rock and roll music. And John Lennon at one stage, he introduced Chuck Berry in a TV show in America. And he said, if you wanted to give rock and roll another name, you'd call it Chuck Berry. That's how high esteem he held Chuck Berry. And both of them recorded, Chuck Berry and Bo Diddley recorded at Chess Records. And the Beatles played their songs in their early club engagements, but they also recorded 2 songs of Chuck Berry. And even right to the end, the last tour that they did was 1966, they still played Chuck Berry songs. Sam Cooke, they both recognized, when I say both, I mean Lennon and McCartney, they both recognized Sam Cooke as a major influence on their music. And that's because in the 1960s, they became enamored with rhythm and blues music, with African-American soul music. And Sam Cooke, they said, was a major influence. And they both said that his song, Bring It On Home to Me, was one of their favorite ever songs. And when they both recorded solo albums after the Beatles split up, they both of them recorded that song. Now, also in the 60s, a lot of people used to ask the Beatles, you know, who was your favorite artist at the time? And the 2 ones that they used to mention a lot was Major Lance and the Impressions. Again, both of these were Chicago artists from the 1960s. And the picture you can see on the screen is them coming back from America after their first visit. They first visited America in February 1964. And you can see them here getting off the plane as they arrived in London. And you can probably just see Paul McCartney is there at the front. And under his arm is a Major Lance record. Now, in terms of Muddy Waters and Elmore James and Chicago blues, I wouldn't say it plays a major influence in their music, but they always said that they liked Chicago blues. And there's a story in my book actually about that they wanted to see a Chicago blues club when they're in Chicago. And they also name checked both Muddy Waters and Elmore James on the Abbey Road album. If you play that in, I think it's Come Together, they mention Muddy Waters, and then For You Blue, they mention Elmore James. Now, the first records that the Beatles released in America were released on VJ Records. And the first one of those was a single, was Please Please Me, and that was released in February 1963. And the first album that the Beatles released in America was introducing the Beatles, and that was released in January 1964. And both of them were on VJ Records, an African-American owned label in the South Loop of Chicago. And the picture on the left shows you the building as it was in the 60s. And the picture on the right is one that I took this summer. So you can see the building is clearly still there, but it's a vacant building. But it plays a major role in Beatles history. VJ was the first label to release Beatles music in America. Now, WLS, that was a major top 40 radio station in Chicago. And I think they play two roles in the Beatles story. The first is the documented evidence that we have is that one of their DJs called Dick Bionde was the first DJ to play a Beatles song in America. Now, I say documented because it's on a survey that the radio station used to produce. So that was again in February 1963. The other claim to fame of WLS is they had a huge transmitter, a huge signal that could be heard all over pretty much most of America, certainly all over the Midwest and up into Canada. And so therefore, and also I should say that the nickname of the station, WLS, was the world's loudest station because of that signal. And so therefore, when they played Beatles music, they broke it in the Midwest, into Canada, and also further afield as well. So WLS plays a major role in Beatles history. Now, the Beatles played on 3 occasions in Chicago. They played in the summer of '64, the summer of '65, and the summer of 1966 was the last time they played here. And they played one concert in '64, and in '65 and '66 they played twice. So altogether they played 5 separate concerts on 3 separate tours. And the only other place that has played more concerts than that is New York. So 5 concerts in Chicago is the most that any other city besides New York as Beatles concerts. And then I'm just showing you on the screen here, these are the programs that the promoters called Triangle Productions, and they released these 3 programs. And again, Chicago's claim to fame, they're the only city that produced 3 programs for each of their tours. Good old Chicago. Now, this picture shows you, if you went to see the Beatles in 1965 in White Sox Park, this is the view you would have had. You can just about see them ants in the middle of the field. But when they played in 1965, they played 2 concerts in White Sox Park. They played an afternoon concert and an evening concert. And the combined audience for those 2 concerts was 62,000 people. And that was the most that the Beatles played in front of in one day in any of their North American tours. So take that, New York. Now, like John said, we're coming up to the 40th anniversary of John Lennon's death. It's actually on Tuesday, on December the 8th. And so I just wanted to mention a couple of connections that John Lennon had with Chicago. And I should say there's many other connections that I could have mentioned about the Beatles. I'll just move on to the John Lennon. And the most famous press conference that the Beatles ever partook in was in Chicago in 1966, in August 1966. And that was when John Lennon had to apologize for his comments about Christianity and the popularity of the Beatles. If you think about, you know, the Beatles press conferences, that's the one that everybody talks about, and surely is the most famous press conference they ever undertook. Now, also, when John Lennon met up with Yoko Ono, who's an artist, they made movies. And some of these movies were very strange movies. I don't know if I'd really recommend you watching many of these, but anyway. And the first movie they made was called Smile. And it's a 52-minute film where you see John Lennon smiling. It never won an Oscar. And I wish you good luck if you want to sit through 52 minutes, as much as you like John Lennon, watching him smile. But anyway, the first time that that was their first movie, but the first time that that was shown, and any movie that they made, it was shown in Chicago in the International Film Festival. And I should say that it was played to a packed house, pretty obviously. But by the end of the show, the newspaper said that the theatre was only half full. Now, another connection between the Beatles and, between John Lennon and Chicago is the last occasion that John Lennon was in Chicago was in May 1972. And he was interviewed by Jet magazine, an African-American magazine in Chicago. He went to Mr. Kelly's, which was a club on Rush Street. And he also appeared on a local TV show. But by all accounts, or this is what Yoko Ono said later on, they were very enamored with Lake Michigan, just the whole size of that huge stretch of water in Chicago, in the Midwest. And so therefore, Yoko Ono wrote a song, and that song became Walking on Thin Ice, which was, like I say, influenced by what she saw in Lake Michigan. And it just so happens the very last song that John Lennon worked on before he was assassinated was this song, Walking on Thin Ice. Okay, so let me just give you a few sort of stories from the book about the joy that the Beatles brought to Chicago. And there's no doubt about it that hair does play a big role in the Beatles story. Personally, it's not something I like to spend too much time talking about, but we have to do it. And in terms of the Beatles, they first appeared on live TV in February the 9th, 1964, on the Ed Sullivan Show, which I'm so sure many of the people watching this now will remember pretty vividly. And one of the things that people were absolutely stunned by was the length of their hair. They could not believe the hair that they saw on their heads. And if you look at the newspapers in the week after the Ed Sullivan Show, there's a lot of people that were interviewed about their opinions about the Beatles. And it's amazing how many of them talk about that they liked the music, but they didn't like the Beatles' wigs. They seriously thought that the Beatles were wearing wigs. Anyway, but a lot of people did like the wigs. And what they wanted to do is they wanted a Beatles haircut, and they wanted it now. And as you can imagine, you can brush your hair forward Beatles style, but it takes a while for it to grow long. And so therefore, a lot of people took a shortcut, and they went to the local stores to buy Beatles wigs. And this is a picture of a downtown in the Loop department store. And you can see here the people trying on their Beatles wigs. And many of them don't look to me like they're teenagers. So I don't know if they're buying them for themselves or for their children, but they're all trying on the Beatles wigs. And believe it or not, this was what the general sales manager of Goldblatt's said. The man who manufactures the wig is turning them out at a rate of 20,000 a day, with orders for more than 300,000. They were selling like hotcakes. So anyway, if anybody here is one of these Beatles wigs, please send me a photo, and I'd love to see what they look like now. Okay, now, one of the things I wanted to do in the book, I wanted to basically, the book is about the response to the Beatles in Chicago. And of course, Chicago is a large African-American population. They seem to be ignored a lot in the Beatles story. And so I wanted to sort of like put them central to the story. And, you know, you can look at sort of things like the Chicago Defender newspaper to sort of see how a lot of black people liked the Beatles just as much as white people did. But one of the people I interviewed in the book for, you know, to talk about the African-American experience was somebody called Cynthia Dagnall. And she was like many other 12-year-olds in February 1964. She saw the Beatles on the Ed Sullivan Show. She fell in love. And in end of August 1964, she went to the premiere of A Hard Day's Night with her friend, which was premiered downtown in Chicago. And she then went to the concert in 1964. They played September the 5th down in the International Amphitheatre on the southwest side. And if you notice pictures, well, a lot of pictures from the Beatles concerts, there's not that many African Americans in the audience, and that was because they felt intimidated. A lot of them felt that there was, it was basically mostly white people. Some of the places where the concerts were a bit dangerous for African Americans. Certainly the southwest of Chicago at the time was. And so when Cynthia and her friend went to the concert, they were chaperoned by their mothers, who took them right up to the door and then basically deposited them in the at the concert. But anyway, so the two of them got fifth row seats, and they saw the Beatles in 1964. And then the following year, they went back again to see them in White Sox Park in Chicago, 1965. And she was always a Beatles fan, right up until the end. She loved the Beatles. And when she was an adult, she became a music critic. And she was a music critic for the Chicago Sun-Times. And she also wrote in Rolling Stone. And then in 1978, Ringo came to Chicago to appear on the Donahue show. And she finally met one of her heroes. Now, when I'll say a little bit more about this later, but when the Beatles came to Chicago in 1964, they never actually stayed overnight. They only spent a few hours in Chicago. But so therefore, when they came in 1965, that was the first time that they stayed overnight in Chicago. They spent 2 nights at the Sahara Inn Hotel, which is out near the airport on Mannheim Road. It's no longer there, but that's where the hotel was. And the hotel made a slight mistake. And the mistake they made was that a month before the concert, they announced that the Beatles were staying at their hotel. Yeah. So therefore, thousands of teenagers booked rooms in the hotel. So when the Beatles arrived, and they arrived there at 4 o'clock in the morning from, I think it was Houston they came in from, there was hundreds of teenagers waiting for them outside the hotel. And then for the next 2 days, the hotel was described as like being in a student dorm. And one of the people I spoke to was she's the daughter of one of the general managers at the hotel. And she begged her, she was a teenager at the time, and she begged her father to let her stay at the hotel, which she did. And she got a room across the hallway from the 2 rooms that the Beatles stayed in. She met the Beatles, and she also told me some stories about the comings and goings into the Beatles rooms. Now, I know there's a lot of young people viewing this morning, so I'll leave it to your imagination. But if you want to read more, it's in the book. and again, I wanted to interview a lot of fans because they got some amazing stories, you know, about the Beatlemania. And you know, a lot of them met the Beatles. I had one person I interviewed who she saw them in 1966, and just before the Beatles came on, she went to the bathroom and she got lost on the way back and ended up backstage at the Beatles. So anyway, but the story I thought was really interesting was this one here. This is Katie Davidson, who again was a teenager. She saw them on the, she's from St. Louis. She saw them on the Ed Sullivan show. She was, you know, overblown by what she saw. And she set out to wanting to meet the Beatles. She actually wanted to meet them. And she thought of a great way. And the great way was she'd go to one of their press conferences. So she found out they didn't play in St. Louis, but she found out that they played in Chicago in 1965. And through a long, convoluted way, she became the press rep, the press representative for 17 magazine at the Beatles press conference in Chicago in 1965. And she brought along her recorder. She was only a young teenage girl. She brought along a pencil and a notebook and a camera. And the tape recorder didn't work. The camera, she was so nervous that she never really got any sort of great pictures. But anyway, so this is one of the pictures she took. And her favorite was George Harrison. And she even got to ask George a question at the press conference. Now, I also interviewed a lot of the musicians that played with the Beatles. And again, a lot of them have got stories about, you know, the meetings and their concerts and behind the scenes and whatever. But one of the ones I was really intrigued was I spoke to somebody called Earl Pickens. And in 1965, he was pursuing a, what you call a dual career. And on the one hand, he was a medical student. He wanted to be a doctor. So in 1965, he signed up for the University of Chicago, the medical school at the university. He was a student at the medical school at the University of Chicago. And at the same time, he was in a band, which was called the Rondells. And they were playing in Atlantic City in 1965. And it just so happens that a friend of Brian Epstein, the Beatles manager, saw them play in Atlantic City. His name was Nat Wise. And he told Brian Epstein, and Brian Epstein became their manager. Yeah. And they also didn't like the name Rondells. And so they changed their name. And the person who came up with the name, The Circle, you can see how it's spelt there, was John Lennon. And they recorded a Paul Simon song. And that was Red Rubber Balloon. Yeah. And Red Rubber Ball. And it was at #2 in the Billboard chart when The Circle became the support act on the 1966 Beatles tour of North America. So there he was on vacation from the University of Chicago, and he was touring with the Beatles. And at the end of the tour, or shortly after, he had to make a choice. He chose the medical field, and he's now a successful surgeon in Florida. Earl, if you're viewing this, hello. Okay, and the Beatles had a reputation of being partiers. They liked to enjoy themselves. They were known as partiers. If you wanted to go and have a good time, go out with the Beatles. But in the summer of 1966, they were out partied by, of all people, the Beach Boys. Yeah, the Beach Boys, those surfing dudes from California. And in the summer of 1966, the Beatles played at, they were back at International Amphitheater in Chicago. And the same night that they played there, the Beach Boys were playing in Springfield, the state capital. And so Mike Love, he's the man on the top right there of the hat, and Bruce Johnson, the one on the bottom left there, they decided, Mike Love had already met the Beatles before, so he knew them. They decided to surprise the Beatles. What a great idea. So they chartered a plane and flew after their concert in Springfield. they flew to Chicago. They landed at Midway Airport and they got a cab to the Astor Tower Hotel, which is where the Beatles were staying. And the Beatles, this at 1 o'clock in the morning, they arrived. The Beatles, who had just come in from London, they just did that very stressful press conference. They were in bed. So the Beach Boys woke them up and they even played them a new song on the hotel piano called Good Vibrations. And it still did nothing to energize the Beatles. And when they left, they spoke to a reporter back in Springfield. And Mike Love said, the Beatles were a drag. They don't know how to party at all. It must have been the 7th day for them. All they wanted to do was rest. It must be the California sun. But there you go. But anyway, so, and I should say after that, they never slept at all, the Mike Love and Bruce Johnson. They went off and played another concert. Okay. Now, the other thing I wanted to bring out in the book is not just about fans, but about people that were actually inspired to become musicians by the Beatles. And, you know, I know there's a lot of things on the screen here, but the basic gist of it is that a lot of people started to buy guitars and drums, not only because of the Beatles. I mean, there was a folk revival going on as well. So people bought acoustic guitars, but certainly the Beatles played a major role in this. And that's because when people saw them on the Ed Sullivan Show in February 1964, it looked easy what they were doing. It looked easy and it looked fun because there was no backing singers, there was no horn section, there was no dance routines. There were just 4 friends on stage having a good time. And a lot of budding musicians thought, this is easy. You know, I want to do that. That's fun. And so, you know, all over America, and certainly in Chicago, a number of people started to form bands because of the Beatles. And in terms of the bands that were formed, you know, there were so many in Chicago, but the first one to produce a record that became a hit in the local charts was this band here called New Colony 6. They had a very successful career in the 1960s. I'm not sure about their gimmick. Their gimmick was to dress up a sort of like revolutionary, American revolutionary, that is, uniforms, and call themselves New Colony 6, but you know, whatever. But anyway, so New Colony 6. And then another band that became very popular was a Northwest suburban band called the Shadows of Night. And they were the first of these Beatles influenced groups to hit the national charts, and they got a top 10 hit with Gloria in early 1966. And most of you probably know that song, Gloria. It was a Van Morrison song that they made a version of, and you know, it's a good song, but I think they actually made a far better song than that. And the other thing I just wanted to say about this is that a lot of these bands, when they formed bands because they admired the Beatles, the Beatles just, you know, made it look so easy. They found out it wasn't easy. You know, the chord structures that the Beatles had on their songs were very difficult to emulate. The harmonies that the Beatles used were very, very difficult to copy. And also the personalities of the Beatles were just so charismatic and so humorous that a lot of people just couldn't replicate it. And so therefore, they formed bands because of the Beatles. But I think their music for a lot of these bands were more influenced by other British invasion bands. And of course, I'm thinking here about the Rolling Stones, the Kinks, the Yardbirds, the Animals, these sort of groups. I think in terms of their music, that's really what influenced the Shadows of Night. This is the first band that came out of Chicago that had a #1 record. And these were the Buckinghams, and their song was Kind of a Drag. And their music was more influenced by the Beatles. So, you know, how do you tell without listening to the music whether a band is influenced by the Beatles or influenced by the Rolling Stones? And, you know, I'll tell you very quickly, if you're influenced by the Rolling Stones, you look like that. You look like they want to beat you up. And if you're influenced by the Beatles, you smile. So that it's quite easy to tell. Okay, so if it looks like they're threatening you, that's basically they're influenced by the Stones. And if they look like they want to, if they're smiling, then it looks like they're influenced by the Beatles. Anyway, okay. Okay, now another story in the book that fascinated me was, and again, maybe some of you people went to this club, but this is somebody called Paul Sampson. And he was from a suburb of Chicago called Arlington Heights, northwest suburb. I hope nobody's offended if I say rather sleepy suburb in the 60s. And he owned a record store, small record store in Arlington Heights. And he was in his late 20s. He was married, had kids, And so he was not overly enamored with the Beatles when he saw them on the Ed Sullivan show. So, but of course, he knew that then when young people start coming into his record store, that he could sell Beatles records. So he sold a lot of Beatles records. And then the young people started telling him that they'd love to have a place where they could listen to some of this new music that was being made around the Chicago area. And at that time, there was a lot of stories about the Beatles on TV and radio. And one of the stories was about where they came from. And of course, where they came from was Liverpool. And for a long time, they played in a club, which was called the Cavern. And so Paul Sampson said, I wanted to create a place that looked like the Cavern, the place in England where the Beatles performed. And so in the spring of 1965, he opened a club, which he called the Cellar. And it was called that obviously because cellar and cavern is very similar, but also because it was in the basement of a church building. Anyway, and this is, you can see the picture on the right there. That is the cellar. And you can see there the nets they had and the graffiti on the wall. And this a Beatles influenced Chicago band playing called Saturday's Children. But what was so remarkable about the cellar is that the first cellar, there was two of them actually. The first one was held about 200 people, and it was too small because it became so popular. And so they opened a bigger space of about 700 people, but still pretty small club. And these were some of the bands that played at this cellar in Arlington Heights in the 60s. The Byrds, Buffalo Springfield, including Neil Young, Spencer Davis Group, The Who played there. And Pete Townsend was doing his guitar histrionics, and his guitar got stuck in the nets. The Yardbirds, Jimmy Page, Van Morrison, The Cream, Eric Clapton, Sly and the Fat, etc., etc. Never mind all the local bands that played there as well. Shadows of Night were basically played there every weekend. So it's a remarkable story, the story of Cellar. And that's the cellar was there until 1970. It closed in 1970. And Paul Sampson also became a manager of many local bands. And like I say, it plays a major role in the Beatles story in Chicago. Now, the other thing I wanted to sort of emphasize in the book is about the number of female bands that emerged. Now, before the Beatles, there was female musicians, but there wasn't that many all-female groups. You had female singers, or you had groups like the Ronettes or the Exciters or whatever, which played basically, which were singing groups. But there wasn't, I can't hardly think of any, maybe somebody here can, that was an all-female group that played their instruments before the Beatles. But after the Beatles, a number of them emerged, and especially in the Chicago area, many all-female groups emerged. And I think it's because the Beatles kind of looked a bit feminine. You know, they didn't look too macho. They're kind of a bit androgynous. Their lyrics were very sort of like girl-friendly. They had the harmonies. And so it kind of looked like something that girls could do. And so therefore, a lot of girls formed bands. Now, for all of those living in Rogers Park, this is for you. Because two of these came from Rogers Park. The drummer, Debbie Pomeroy, and the bassist on the left, Andy Levin. And they went to Senn High School. If anybody knows what that is. But anyway, so this is your Roger Park shout out. And the interesting thing for me from this picture is that if you look at Debbie, she's drumming on a Ludwig drum, which is basically the drums that Ringo used. And again, that was a Chicago-based company. And Andy on the left is using a Hofner bass, which is the bass that Paul McCartney used to use. So anyway, but they were just one of a number. But I really recommend. Funny enough, my daughter goes on to something called TikTok, if anybody's familiar with that. And a lot of groups have had hit records or had sales anyway, because their songs have appeared on some TikTok video. Anyway, and Daughters of Eva's one of them. One of their songs called Hey Lover, and I really recommend it. It's a great, great song. And it's kind of getting a lot of play now because of TikTok. Okay, now in terms of people finding the Beatles a very joyful experience, you know, that's true. But a lot of people feared the Beatles. And they thought that they were bringing undue influences, bad influences to America. The screaming girls, the long hair, the sort of irreverence that they were, espousing, and some of the sort of riots that people saw at these concerts, or neo riots that were happening. And so people were very scared by the Beatles. And one of the people that was certainly feared them was the editor of the Tribune. He was the editor of the Tribune throughout the 60s, W.D. Maxwell. And he used to write the editorials. And this was one of the, it wasn't the first editorial, but this is the one that he wrote after the Beatles appeared on the Ed Sullivan Show. So this was the Tribune's welcome to the Beatles in February 1964. And the headline was Human Sheepdogs. The Beatles, England's gift to the Bobby Soxers, have made their debut to American audiences, armed with electric guitars, drums, and sore throats. They make enough noise to bring the plaster down from the ceiling, but the teenagers respond by howling in ecstasy. And again, people today kind of love the Beatles and see them as sort of non-threatening in many ways, but it's incredible how many people were threatened by the Beatles in the 60s and found their music to be just basically unlistenable. So anyway, and also the churches, you know, not just the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church was the biggest denomination in Chicago, but you know, all churches were very critical of the Beatles, or sections of them, I should say. And that's because they might have disliked Elvis Presley, but at least he sang hymns. You know, the Beatles certainly didn't. And he espoused the point that he was a Christian, while the Beatles always sort of said that they were agnostic. They never really committed too much towards Christianity. But anyway, so there was people in the Catholic Church that were critical of the Beatles as well. And this was a priest used to have it shows you the sort of influence of the church really in Chicago. They had he had a column in a few local Chicago newspapers. And he used to talk about the Beatles on a number of occasions. I could have showed you a number of his columns to emphasize the how much he disliked the Beatles. And I think what the church really worried about is that instead of teenagers being concerned with spiritual matters, they seem to be more concerned with sensual matters. So anyway, this is what he says here. If you can read down towards the bottom, I don't know if you can see it very well, but it says here, then there is the stomach upsetting sight of teenage girls screaming in ecstasy over the ludicrous Beatles. Boys, beatniks with high voices and swinging hips, trying to act like little girls. I don't think he liked them. Now, there was a war in Chicago. It was all over America, but it was certainly in Chicago. And that war was over hair, the Great Hair Wars. And basically, some people saw long hair on boys as something that was kind of liberating, that boys could wear their hair in all different styles, and it was kind of like gave them much more freedom. While a lot of other people saw the long hair as a sign of hedonism, a lack of a work ethic, They were worried that they were sort of playing with gender roles. They were kind of being feminized by having long hair. And some were, of course, worried that they were becoming homosexual as they started growing their hair long. So therefore, schools used to ban long hair. Families used to fight over long hair. Clubs used to ban people with long hair. And some people with long hair used to be attacked in the streets. And this is just somebody, again, I interviewed Pete Shelton. He was from Blackpool in the northwest of England. And he was one of a number of these British invasion bands that came to America. And he came to Chicago in 1965. And he was telling me about, he went to, again, Mr. Kelly's club on Rush Street. And he went with a girl. And he was sitting there with the person that's Pete Shelton in this picture is the person second from the right. So you can see how long his hair was at the time. And he was sitting there and somebody walked over to him and said to him, "Are you a boy or are you a girl?" And Pete made the mistake of saying to him, "Kiss me and see." And he said that the guy went berserk, threw over the tables, and basically wanted to tear his head, never mind his hair, from the rest of his body. And there's even, believe it or not, some British musicians being interviewed in British music newspapers were saying that they don't mind coming to some parts of America, but other parts they're trying to avoid because they know that they're going to get beaten up for having long hair. The Great Hair Wars. Personally, I don't like to talk about it anyway. Okay, now who is this man here and why is he worried? Now, this man here is the mayor of Chicago. He became mayor in 1955 and he was elected 5 more times and he died in office in 1976. And if he never died, he'd still be mayor of Chicago. And the reason why he's looking worried is because the Beatles are coming to Chicago. And he's worried because he's a man who likes law and order. And he's a man who doesn't like outside influences. And outside influences mean things like the civil rights movement, anti-war activists, hippies, and the Beatles. And so therefore, when the Beatles came to Chicago in 1964, he made sure that there would be no riots and no disturbances in Chicago. So therefore, none of the hotels would let the Beatles stay overnight. So the Beatles basically just came into Chicago and left. He also wanted to make sure that there wouldn't be crowds greeting the Beatles at the airport. So the Beatles were supposed to come into O'Hare Airport from, they played in Milwaukee the day before, and he switched it, where the Beatles would come into to Midway Airport. And he was hoping that therefore they would arrive anonymously in Chicago at Midway. They would perform and then they would leave within a few hours without anybody really knowing they were even here. And the only slight problem was that the press officer in Chicago at the time leaked the news that they were going to be at Midway Airport. And so therefore 5,000 teenagers were at the airport to greet them, but they wouldn't allow the Beatles to come to the major terminal. They had to go to a terminal way off in the far field. Now, the person that was Mayor Daley kept a kind of low profile, and he used to have people that, used to basically do his bidding. And one of the people that did his bidding was this man here, John Jack Riley. And he was the man who was in charge of special events for the city. So he was the one that came up with the idea of dyeing the Chicago River green. He was the one that was in charge of welcoming the Queen to Chicago in the 1950s, the Queen of England, but he didn't welcome the Beatles at all. And what the teenagers used to do is they used to write to Mayor Daley asking to make the day the Beatles play in Chicago, Beatles Day, or to give them the keys to the city, to welcome them, to give them a function, a big private parade, or all these great ideas teenagers have. And of course, it was Jack Riley's job to respond to these teenagers by telling them basically, hell no. And this is what one of the responses was to one girl who wrote to Mayor Daley. He said to her, please believe me, the Beatles will come to Chicago and the Beatles will leave the next day. The world will not change one bit because their appearance here and their departure. A year from now, don't forget he's talking in 1964, some other entertainer will occupy the spotlight and you will be wondering who were the Beatles. Faintly remember you had heard that name somewhere before. He may have been a good special relations officer in Chicago. He was certainly not a good talent spotter, was poor old Jack Riley. Okay, now towards the end of the 70s, the Beatles made a, I think, sort of purposeful move away from their earlier image. And they became much more serious. They started to adopt ideas that were very much outside the mainstream. And they became very much associated with the counterculture. And so this is a newspaper, the most popular probably counterculture newspaper in Chicago. And they often had articles about the Beatles. And you can see this is from January 1968. You can see Lennon on the cover. And this shows you sort of like who the Seed thought were heroes and who were villains. I probably don't have to spell out to you that the man up on the left, Richard Nixon, was not one of their heroes. But John Lennon certainly was. But what the Beatles started to believe in was they weren't just against the Vietnam War. They became pacifists. They started to voice the idea that all violence and all wars were wrong. They also didn't just criticize Christianity. They also adopted Indian philosophical and religious views. They were also pretty promiscuous. You know, John Lennon left his wife and was seen in public with Yoko Ono and other things. They were also, again, you know, they did publicly, or I should say Paul McCartney publicly said he took LSD, but it's pretty clear from their song lyrics that they were certainly involved in the drug culture. So therefore, in the late 60s, a lot of the pronouncements of the Beatles were, I think they became more extreme. They were much, much more associated with the counterculture. And because of that, they were criticized a lot more. You know, parents in 1964, 65, they kind of indulged their kids. You know, they were the ones that bought the records. They were the ones that bought them tickets to the concerts. They even sat at the concerts with their fingers in their ears to chaperone their children. But by the late 60s, people were a lot more critical of the Beatles because of these more radical pronouncements. And one of the things that sort of like was obvious from this sort of new emphasis on the counterculture is they changed their appearance pretty dramatically. And so you can see the first picture on the left. This is from an official Beatles magazine that was produced in England. And you can see that in August 1963, what they looked like. That was the old mop top, as they were called, Beatles, the Fab Four, smiling, clean cut, etc., etc. This is the Beatles in October 1969. They look to me more like Russian Orthodox priests than they do a pop band. But anyway, that's what they look like in late 69. And a lot of people dislike this sort of movement from the one on the left to the right. But anyway, and the Beatles recognized this themselves, that they were much, much less popular, you know, and this is just what George Harrison said. He said, we went from being the cute, lovable mop tops to being these horrible, bearded hippies. Now, I think that explains why. When you talk to people that are fans of the Beatles, they remember the Ed Sullivan Show. They remember going to see Hard Day's Night. They remember seeing the Beatles in concert. Many of them remember when Sgt. Pepper was released in 1967, but so few of them remember the Beatles breaking up. So if you're out there and you're a Beatles fan in the 60s, see if you fit into that pattern. And also what was happening is they started to gain much, much less coverage in the newspapers towards the 1960s. So I think the point I'm trying to make is they weren't as popular by the end of the 60s, even though they were selling records. I'm not saying they weren't popular, but they were selling records, but they didn't have that sort of mass popularity that they had earlier in the decade. And that's very clear if you look at the newspapers when the Beatles split up. You know, Paul McCartney announced that he was leaving the Beatles, and most people took that as the Beatles were splitting up. And these were the headlines. Now, you'd think it would be front page headlines all over the world. And actually, a lot of books actually say it was. It wasn't. It's not true. Instead, what happened is that it was mentioned, but it was always buried down into the inner pages of these newspapers. So these are just Chicago ones. You can see Chicago Sun-Times there on page 5, Beatles breaking up. You can see there the Tribune, they got it on page 18, Beatle quits. And then this one is Chicago Today, and they just put there a tiny little piece which says, speaking of split, the Beatles did. So it gives you an indication, I think, that they just didn't capture the imagination at the end of the 60s as they did in 1964. Now, you've sat through this, many of you Edgewater residents, and I know really that what you've been waiting for. John, this is what you've been waiting for, isn't it? And that is the Beatles coming to Edgewater. Now, I played that bit of music earlier, and you said that there was static. It sounded great here, but you said there was static. So I want to play you a little bit of an interview that I did in it's about 5 years ago now with the late, great, I'm sad to say he died this year, the late, great WLS DJ and program director, Clark Webber. And he's the one that told me the story of the Beatles coming to Edgewater. And so I want to play, because I thought it would be nice for you to hear it. And I should give you a slight warning if there's any children here. He does say a term that I probably think today would be slightly un-PC. So be aware of that as you listen to this. But anyway, I'm going to play a little bit and then I'll stop it and go back just to make sure that you can hear. Or maybe, John, if you could just put up your fingers if it sounds, you know, give me a thumbs up. Okay. If it's, could you do that? Yeah. Yep. The last one, obviously, you never heard. So let's see. Anyway, here we go. So this is Clark Webber telling us about the Beatles in Edgewater. So as I was saying, Clark Webber basically said that when the Beatles came to Chicago in 1965, WLS were the official sponsors or radio station for the tour, 1965, and they played in White Sox Park. So anyway, he told me the story that before the concerts, the Capitol Records held a luncheon for the WLS DJs and the Beatles at the Saddle and Cycle Club, which is still there. This picture again was taken this summer, so the club is still there. And anyway, he said that he met the Beatles and he liked Paul McCartney. He was less enamored with John Lennon, and he also said that George Harrison got rather annoyed with him. And the reason George Harrison got annoyed with him is because he asked, Clark Webber asked the weather girl at WLS to come along to the luncheon. She wanted to meet the Beatles. So anyway, she got talking to George Harrison, and George Harrison obviously took a liking to her. And when she got up and left, he got annoyed and was wondering where she was going, and blamed. Clark said Harrison blamed him for basically teasing Harrison with the weather girl. Anyway, you can't do this today, I don't think, but the title of the weather girl was WINKY, the Weather Bunny. I don't think you can do that today, but that was her official name at the WLS radio station. And maybe again, some of you remember it, WINKY, the Weather Bunny. But anyway, so after the luncheon at the Saddle and Cycle Club, they went to White Sox Park and they played the concerts. So they played an afternoon and evening concert, and Clark Webber introduced them from the stage, and WINKY was there with Clark Webber, and here they are. Sorry about it. So you can see there's the Beatles playing at, that's the evening show at White Sox Park. And on the far left there, you can see that's Clark Webber. You can also see Mal I think that's Mallow Evans, you can see there. And also you can see, I think is it Dex Card? Maybe some of you know who he is, but I think he's the other DJ. And then of course, there she is, Winky, the Weather Bunny. And look at George Harrison looking over at Winky, the Weather Bunny. Now, it's a great story. You know, Clark told it to me very well. I'm sorry you couldn't hear the audio, but I must be honest with you, I have a slight problem with this story. And I never told John this because I thought if I told him this, he'd probably cancel the whole talk. But I'm not sure that they ever appeared in Edgewater. And the reason why I'm not sure is because no other DJ mentions this. I spoke to a couple of people at Capitol Records, and they don't remember either putting on a luncheon for the Beatles. Also, you'd kind of think that if it was a WLS function, that there'd be interviews with them, that there would be photos from the occasion, and I haven't seen any of them. But again, if anybody out there has, please tell me, because I don't want to say that he's wrong. But sometimes your memory, which is one of the problems of interviewing people 50 years later, sometimes your memory is not the best and you misremember things. And I got a feeling he did misremember this. And also I spoke to the archivist at the Saddle and Cycle Club, and he has also got no recollection, no pictures, no memorabilia, or no record at all of the Beatles playing there. So John and Bob, I'm sorry. I'm here on false pretenses.
Wow.
Okay, I'll give you another one then. Just to cheer you up, there is another Beatles connection with Edgewater. So there you are. And this is with somebody called Fred Fine. And Fred Fine used to live on Sheridan Road, on one of those big tower blocks in the 80s.
No, he was at the Edgewater Beach Apartments.
That's right. But isn't that one of the tall ones?
It's the medium tall one. It's not the big tall one.
Yeah. But yeah, he was at the Edgewater, and it was in the 1980s, I believe, that he was living there. So he was in Edgewater. That's the connection. And in terms of what his connections with the Beatles is, he was one of the founders of Triangle Productions. And Triangle Productions was the promotional company that put the Beatles on in Chicago in '64. In other words, all of their concerts were promoted by Triangle Productions. And he was the founder with somebody called Frank Freed, who's a very interesting person. He's in the book. And also Albert Grossman, who some of you might know. He later on became the manager of Bob Dylan. And them three started this company, which is why it's called Triangle Productions. And but at the time when the Beatles played, Fred had already left the company. But his wife, Doris, worked for the company. And she and Fred never went to the actual concerts. It wasn't really their style of music, but their niece went to the concert. And when the concert finished, Doris Fine, Fred's wife, said to her niece, "Well, did you enjoy yourself?" And the niece said, "Oh, yes." And Doris said, "Did you hear anything?" And the girl said, "No, not a note." And on that point, now I'm hoping you heard that. Did you hear that, John? Can you give me thumbs up on that one? Okay, well, I'm going to do it again. This is to wake people up that have fallen asleep. Now, like I said, there was a few things that I mentioned there where, I always like clarification on a lot of things. Maybe they were at the Saddle and Cycle Club. So if anybody is out there and they want to contact me with any information about the Beatles in Chicago, this is my email address. You can all write it down. It's johnlyons899@gmail.com. And please write to me. I'm quite happy to hear. If you've got any photos from the Beatles in Chicago, I'd like to see them. Again, the book's finished, so I won't get in the book, but it'd be nice to hear from anybody that either saw them or has got stories about, or can verify some of these stories. And just briefly, I know I've gone way over what I wanted to speak, but they also there's a story about the Beatles appearing also, attending or arriving at the Margie's. I don't know if people know that story. John, do you know that story? Is that they went to Margie's after they appeared at White Sox Park in 1965, and they showed up there with 5 girls. And you know Margie's, you know where I'm talking about, the one on Western and
Armitage.
Yeah,
Yes.
and you know, that story is also one that is hotly debated by me. I debate myself about this story because in some ways I kind of think, yes, it's all plausible. But on the other hand, you know, we do lack a little bit of evidence. So again, if anybody knows anything about that story and you want to tell me, or any other story about the Beatles, I'd be happy to hear. But on that note, I'm going to say thanks for listening. I hope everybody's now woken back up. I'm going to hand it back to John. And I think he's going to kindly take your questions, and I'm going to do my best to answer them. So let's see if I can get out of this. Do you think I can?
I think you can leave it up.
Shall I?
If anyone has any questions, if you want to type them into the box, and then once we go through a few of those questions, we'll open it up to the floor for comments and questions. I know I got a few friends on the program who have definitely seen the Beatles, so we'll try to get their experiences. But the Margie's story, I didn't know there was any debate about that. It's kind of a legend, and from what
It's me debating it. Nobody else is.
John Lennon got up on the tabletop and sang, is the story I've heard.
Do you want me to tell you why I'm a little bit dubious? Do you want me to?
Yes, please.
Okay. The reason why I'm a little bit dubious about that story is because, firstly, is that there was no mention of it at the time. You'd kind of think that the Beatles always have reporters with them on these tours, and none of them put that in any of their reports about they stopped off at Margie's. They allegedly were with 5 girls that came into. I've yet to hear from any of those 5 girls. And also, you'd think that there would be autographs or maybe photos or some memorabilia. There isn't. There's no evidence, physical evidence, that they were actually there. And then the last point is that this was first written about by the owner of Margie's in the late 1980s. That's the first time I could see recorded evidence of her telling this story. So again, I'm not, disputing what she's saying. The fact is that maybe they were at the Margie's, or maybe she's misremembered somebody else coming into Margie's, or maybe it's true. I don't know, but I would like to know more about it, because it rankles with me that the story only comes to light 20, 25 years later. And as an historian, we do kind of like to have physical evidence of it, and I just don't see any. So that's why I'm a little bit. Sorry, John.
One of the great mysteries of Chicago history that we'll have to try to bore deeper into.
Well, that's it. And exactly, it's the same with the Saddle and Cycle Club.
Uh-huh.
Were they there? Is somebody viewing this today, could verify any of that?
Someone asked McCartney whether he remembers, or Ringo.
You know what? Funnily enough, they didn't respond to my email. The Saddle and Cycle Club. But what? Funny you should say that. People say that. Why didn't you interview them? Or, wouldn't it be great if you could interview them? They wouldn't remember any of this. They've done so much in their lives that they don't remember. If you ever see them getting interviewed, they have the same stories they tell all the time. And, they just would not remember so much of what happened in the 60s. I'm sorry to say that. Well, a lot of us wouldn't. Not that I was there, but I'm just saying,
I can't remember much of the 90s.
Exactly. I can't remember what I did yesterday. So to remember what you did, back in the 1960s is really asking a lot, which is what I say about Clark Webber. I'm not, you could easily misremember this. And also, I should say, people I interviewed, some of the stories they told me, I just couldn't use in the book, because I just couldn't verify that they were, really happened. So I wanted stories that sound plausible, were verified by other people, et cetera, et cetera. because the Margie, so let me just say last thing, John, sorry, about the Margie story. The reason why it's credible is that they played in they played in White Sox Park in '65. Okay, so if you know where that is in Chicago, it's the southwest side. They stayed at the Sahara Inn, which is near O'Hare Airport. So if you actually look at it, Margie's is actually on that route, isn't it? It really is. I mean, it's not that way out of your way to go from, you know, the southwest side up to O'Hare Airport. You could go along, you know, just veer off onto Western. But the one about the Saddle and Cycle Club, you kind of would have to go a bit out of your way to go between the Sahara and Comiskey Park, White Sox Park. So anyway, sorry, over to you.
Okay. Well, we have lots of commentary flying by on our chat board here. We have a Luis Gutierrez with us. I don't know if that's our former congressman, but if so, welcome.
Even if it's
does anyone
not,
have any specific questions or for John, or should we just open it up and try to take a couple of stories? Actually, if I could pose one question, do you have any more detail about the news conference that John Lennon that the Beatles held to kind of allay the enormous angst over his comments about the Beatles being more popular than Jesus?
Right now,
that was held on Michigan Avenue, I believe.
Yeah. Okay. Now that story is it takes up quite a big portion of the book. It's a major part of the Beatles story, and in Chicago. And the first thing I'd say about that is other people have written about the story, but they see it as something that was basically. Well, I should say, if people don't know the story, he made a comment in a magazine in England in March 1966, and it was reprinted in a teen magazine called Datebook. Came out just before they toured here in August, so it came out end of July. And when it came out at the end of July, a couple of DJs in Alabama were outraged that he basically said that the Beatles were more popular than Jesus. And it took on a life of its own, and there became, you know, a lot of radio stations were banning the Beatles. A lot of bonfires of Beatles memorabilia records were being reported on. And a lot of people saw it as something that was kind of minor that happened in the South. But what I found is it wasn't minor at all. It was all over America that people were basically up in arms about what Lennon had said, including in Chicago. And there was bonfires from California of Beatles memorabilia, from California to Illinois to New York. I mean, they're everywhere. And so it wasn't a minor event, it was a major one. And that concert tour, virtually all of the concerts never sold out, you know, because of, it wasn't only because of Lennon. I think the Beatles were already becoming a touch stale by then, but it was also, I think, a lot to do with Lennon's comments. And the ones in Chicago sold out because they only appeared at the International Amphitheater that year, which was a much smaller concert than the one they played at White Sox Park. And even then, the Triangle Productions had to give away a lot of the tickets because they couldn't sell them. And again, that's a big part of the story in my book. But anyway, in terms of the news conference, then the first concert of that tour was in Chicago. And he came to Chicago and he gave a news conference. We actually gave two news conferences. One is the one that he gave to the sort of national media, and then one that he gave to sort of like the DJs and local reporters and whatever. And he basically apologized for what he'd said. And really what he meant to say was that Christianity was in decline, and that teenagers are now more enamored by the Beatles than they were by Christianity. But it was taken as saying that the Beatles were better than Jesus Christ. But anyway, in terms of who did I interviewed two people that were at the press conference. And one of them was a Tribune reporter. She couldn't remember anything, which is, again, this problem that I was saying about people's memories. It's difficult, you know, trying to remember details of something that happened 50 years ago. And the other person I interviewed was he worked for WCFL. which was the, maybe some of you remember that. That was the other radio station that became a rival to WLS. And they were the ones that promoted the 66 tour. So they were around the 66 tour, not WLS was the 65 tour. Anyway, and they had their assistant program director was at the news conference, and he recorded it. And he was telling me about, a bit more detail about the news conference. But I mean, what we know about it is that he did basically apologize, and you can see his words are a bit mealy-mouthed, but he did, and he did because he was really worried. There's no doubt about it. He thought that the tour was going to be a disaster if he didn't apologize, but also they were worried they were going to be assassinated. And Ku Klux Klan were picketing some of their concerts. They thought that they'd been actually shot when they played in Memphis because a cracker went off at the audience, and they were scared, and there's no doubt about it. And it played a big role in why the Beatles stopped touring after 1966, and it did impact their record sales. You know, if I remember right, Yellow Submarine was released at that time, and it never made it to #1 in America. Other artists that had covered Beatles songs at the time, thinking that they got a surefire hit, found that they didn't, and they blamed Lennon's comment. So anyway, it is in the book, the story, and it is a remarkable story. But I think it was much more widespread than other authors have recognized up to now.
We have so that news conference recording still exists.
Yeah, you can hear. Yes. Oh, yeah. It's not that on you. You can hear. It's on YouTube as well.
On YouTube. Okay.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. You can hear everything he said. Yeah.
Great. We have one question here. Did you make any effort to interview George's sister Louise, who lives down in Southern Illinois?
Yes, I did. I did speak to Louise. I spoke to her about 5 years ago. She's a wonderful woman, and she was a wonderful interview. And again, for those people that don't know, she left Liverpool when George was a boy. So she never actually saw the Beatles rise to fame in England. She never saw them at the Cavern or, never saw anything about them. And she moved around with her husband. She ended up in Benton, South Illinois. And when the Beatles started to record records, started to make music, Love Me Do and whatever, Please Believe, she started to promote the band. And so she told me a lot of stories about how she started to promote the band, but she also came to the concerts. And so she was at the 64 and 65 concert. She stayed at the hotel that I mentioned. She told me about that, the Sahara Inn. And also she appeared on radio, and she worked for a number of radio stations, and she appeared regularly on WLS. And she also told me, so yeah, I did interview Louise, and she's very, very nice woman. And yeah, so I did.
Mike, can we open up the phone lines, as it were, and allow any of our guests to chime in with questions or stories they might want to share?
Yeah, I should be able to do that. One sec. All right, participants should be able to unmute themselves.
Okay. Well, we have a lot of people here, but I see Nathan Sturm has been chatting a lot in the chat box, and sounds like he's got a lot of interesting stories. Do you want to share anything, Nathan?
Email me, Nathan.
You need to unmute yourself, Nathan. That's down in the lower left-hand corner of the screen.
Sorry about that. Yes, I was muted.
Hello, Nathan.
I cheated, and I've shared the link. So I'm sort of a colonial animal. I'm a collective. There's at least one other Nathan Sturm chiming in. I think it's my friend Phil in Indianapolis. So I'll, at this point, I just wanted to say this is really a wonderful presentation. I'm really looking forward to seeing the book.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, it's coming out in February. Yeah.
Yeah. No. What?
Anybody else?
Yeah, I have an interesting story that wasn't touched on that it may be in your book. I work at WLS TV and produced several Beatles in Chicago related stories that aired the nights that the Beatles anthology was on the air in 1995. And the one that I thought was the most kind of intriguing was about Ludwig drums and the possibility that the Ludwig drums may have had a role in creating the Beatles logo. And here's the story that was told to my friend Janet Davies, my colleague, by William Henry Ludwig III told this story. He claimed that when, the Beatles did their first album, Ringo still had his original Premier drums, which were a pretty cheap set of drums, although they did the job on that album, certainly. But he wanted to upgrade his drums, and he was these Ludwig drums at I think it was called Drum City appealed to him, and he was really impressed that they were expensive imported drums, and he asked for the Ludwig logo to be bigger than what was normally supplied on the drums. And the Drum City folks were fine with that. I think the guy's name was Ivor Arbiter, and he's kind of well known in guitar circles. The story was that Brian Epstein said, well, that's all well and good, but if you're going to have the big Ludwig logo, how about a big Beatles logo? And Ivor Arbiter, according to Ludwig, drew an initial sketch of the Beatles logo with that drop T. Now, whether that's true or not, I don't know. There's another sign painter that's generally credited with, painting the original drum head. But that's the story that was told by William Henry Ludwig of Ludwig Drums here in Chicago.
Okay, yeah, I can say a little bit about that. Okay, so basically, the first part of the book is about how the Beatles loved America so much. Really, they were so enamored with America that when Ringo went into that drum shop and he found out that Ludwig was an American company from Chicago, he made sure that they kept Ludwig on the drums. He wanted that to be prominent, because I said to him, do you want it taken off because it's just advertising? He said no. He was really enamored with the idea that it was an American company. So anyway, so he kept that on. The story about the Beatles logo, I'm doubtful. So I'll leave it at that. I'm doubtful about Ludwig did that. But what I do know is that when the Beatles appeared in Chicago in 1964, that the president of Ludwig at the time gave Ringo a gold drum.
Right. We interviewed the daughter that was with him
and the daughter was there as well. There's
time.
a famous picture of it, isn't there?
Yeah, it's a lovely picture.
Yeah. And the nice thing I liked is that by all accounts, the owner or the president of Ludwig has a huge house, big house. And he called it the house that Ringo built. And that was because when he appeared on, again, from this angle, people kind of don't see that Ringo was very, very popular. And in February 1964, when they appeared on the Ed Sullivan Show, he was very prominent on the screen, which is very unusual for drummers at the time. Usually drummers were just sort of like slung at the back somewhere, and you just kind of heard them but never saw them. He was up high on a riser, and you can see quite clearly that it says Ludwig on his drums. And so that was a great advertisement for the Chicago company. And of course, they ended up making millions out of this. The factories had to basically increase their size to keep up with the output. And so many of the people I interviewed that were drummers said that they actually got the Ludwig drums because of that. So yeah, it's another amazing Chicago connection between between the Beatles and Ludwig.
Can I chime in with something? Can you hear?
Yes?
Yeah. Hello. Yeah.
Okay. I'm of the age where I was already in the Army when the Beatles became famous. And one of the things I like to talk about is that a difference between being a Beatle fan back then and being one later on is that we had to wait for each new song to come out. You didn't get them all in one broadside, as it were. But I had an experience, and this is maybe about 5 or 6 years ago. Every year I go to the Printers Row Book Fair, and one year they featured, if I remember correctly, it was John Cass, and it might have been Eric Zorn. I don't recall exactly who they were, but they had a debate about who is better, the Beatles or the Stones. What I realized they were debating was who do I like better, not who is better, because it struck me as ludicrous. The music of the Beatles is so far beyond the music of the Stones, regardless of which one you like better. And I started pursuing that, and I'd like to refer people who have musical background to a website. There's a gentleman by the name of Mike Pacelli who does has quite a few roughly half an hour to hour long sessions on what makes the Beatles music, and how it is different from all other pop music. Basically starting out with that they did not use rock and roll chords, they used jazz chords. But it's Mike Pacelli, it's MikePacelli.com. And they're just fascinating. If you have musical background, if you understand chords and basic music theory, it's just fascinating to see what it is that makes the Beatles music, and why it's been so long lasting, which I think we just accept without questioning, why is this, why the Beatles and not some other group. But it's certainly worth pursuing for people who do understand music. That's what I wanted to say.
Yeah, I mean, let me just follow up on that. Yeah, it's very good. Yeah, I'll look that up. That was kind of a bit of the point I was trying to make about some of these bands, that they were influenced by the Beatles to become, to join a group or form a group. But when it came to playing the music, they found that Beatles style music was actually difficult to play.
Right.
And like I say, their personalities were so charismatic, you couldn't basically, so therefore they were delighted when the Rolling Stones came along, because the Rolling Stones music was, I'm not saying I love the Rolling Stones, but their music was a bit easier to play. And also you didn't have to smile. You could just basically look like you were going to beat somebody up, and, you were going to take somebody's daughter away, and you could become a pop star. And so that's basically why I think the Rolling Stones and the Kinks and Yardbirds, Animals, all them groups were influential in what the music sounded like.
Yeah.
Well, the Beatles, I think, were most influential in actually, getting people to form bands.
Yeah.
Anyway,
One of the things that really struck me is that all three of the string players, Paul, John, and George, were musical geniuses. And it was something you didn't touch on at all, and I'm glad, is this Paul is dead, and he's been replaced by someone who looks just like him. And just the odds of three musical geniuses coming together at one point is so small. The idea of replacing one of them, makes it impossible. But when you mention about Ringo being up on a high stage and being focused on much more, if I remember correctly, and I watched this, I was stationed in Hawaii at the time, 25th Division, and everything stopped on the island so we could watch the show. And if I remember correctly, it was because of his smile, and he kept flashing the smile. And this is really, if I remember correctly, one of the main things that sold the Beatles as a famous group.
Yeah. No, you're right. You're absolutely right. And just the fact that he looked so much part of the group. It was the four of them. It wasn't just basically a singer out front and then everybody else just at the back playing the music. They all seemed like four equal parts, and they just seemed like a gang of friends.
Yes.
They just seemed like a group of friends that got up on stage, and people thought, wow, I could do this. It looks so much fun. And like I say, I mentioned about the Daughters of Eve, but a lot of girls, for the first time, I think, were really influenced by the Beatles to form bands. And Ringo certainly does play a major role. There's no doubt about it. And also, he's a great drummer.
Yes, he is.
Yeah, he is. I mean, he doesn't do anything too fancy, but and then he came into his own when he was in the recording studio. He was then more than just somebody who could keep the time. He was somebody who was very innovative in his drumming as well. But yeah, thank you for that point. That's very good that you said that.
Well, we're approaching an hour and 45 minutes.
Can I say anything related?
Sure, jump in.
I have this book. Is it backwards? I don't understand how it's backwards for you, but it's called...
It's only backwards for you.
Oh, it is? Oh, okay.
Yeah.
We all see it forward.
Yeah.
It says Beatles versus Stones.
Yeah.
And it's by John McMillan. And I really haven't read it yet, but during the pandemic, I'm actually reading unread books from my bookshelves. But anyway, it's the one thing that I thought was amazing was that the Beatles, who looked squeaky clean at the beginning, were kind of the tough Liverpool guys, and the Stones, who looked like the tough guys, were suburbanites.
Yes.
So
Liverpool School of
everything is in
Economics.
marketing.
Yeah, I've read that book, and that's what he emphasizes in the book. That all the things that we kind of think about the sweet Beatles were basically wrong, and everything we thought about the tough working class Stones was also wrong. So
The way they want to present themselves.
yeah,
It's all image making.
yeah, they wanted to. I mean, a lot of the bands, once the Beatles came forward, also they wanted to be the anti-Beatles. You know, that was basically it. You want to be, you don't, if you copy the Beatles, you're not going to get far. So therefore you want to be the opposite of the Beatles. And I think that's what the Stones tried to do, was become the opposite of the Beatles.
Is that what the Who and the Kinks were shooting for as well?
To a degree, yeah. I mean, the Who were never smilers either. Did you ever see them smile? And the one that I always think is the complete opposite, that really did want to emphasize that, was Led Zeppelin. If any of you are familiar with Led Zeppelin, in 1969, they started to basically produce albums that were very popular in America. They never released singles. They never appeared on British TV on any shows. You never saw them interviewed. They were the complete opposite of the Beatles, and that was again purposeful. They wanted to become mysterious and unknown. And even today, I'm always amazed at how many interviews Paul McCartney and Ringo Starr do. It is quite incredible. They're out there. If you try and, I tried to read every interview that they ever did. And, that was virtually impossible because they just gave so many. And it's because they had such winning personalities and they were so easy and charismatic in front of the camera or on paper. While Led Zeppelin went out of their way to basically give very few interviews, very rarely on TV. And therefore they had this mystery about them. That I think people bought into. But yeah, that's a good book that you got there. Yeah. Thank you for your comments.
The first group to actually go be pitted against them was the Dave Clark Five.
Yeah, but I think the Dave Clark Five was a little bit like them though, weren't they? They had the smiling sort of suits, and they weren't so much anti-Beatles. They were kind of like a right. Beatles plus a drummer.
But they didn't have the music.
No.
They
Very
did have,
unbelievably
Dave Clark
popular.
had the business know-how.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about the 60s, everybody straight away thinks of the Beatles, the Stones, the Who, then the Yardbirds or whatever. But the Dave Clark Five was so popular in 1965 or so. It was incredible, really.
I always thought Clark Weber manufactured that because he was for the Dave Clark Five and Art Roberts was for the Beatles.
Yes, they did. Yeah.
Dave Clark Five didn't hold a candle to the Beatles. And I just thought that they made it up.
Yeah, it made it entertaining radio, didn't it? To have these two DJs basically allegedly at war with one another. But in actual fact, they were great friends.
Oh, I love WLS.
Yeah.
Anything more?
I have a quick anecdote if there's time.
Sure.
So I grew up in a suburb of Milwaukee, and our across the street neighbors and friends, included Gordon Hinckley, who was the number one drive time guy in Milwaukee for decades. Weirdly, into his 80s, he was the number one drive time DJ. And it was either 64, 65, he interviewed the Beatles. And I remember his kids racing across the street to us with these little flat plastic boxes stuffed with cotton and with the cigarette butts of each Beatle. And so with magic marker on each box was John, Paul, Ringo, George. And so we got exposed at the age of 9 to cigarette butts from the Beatles.
Wow.
Well, there's a famous clip that of a guy that cut up all the Beatles bed sheets and sold them.
Yeah.
I knew this guy personally. Richie Victor was his name. He was a director at ABC from like the early 60s on. And he actually gave me a copy of one of those when he found out I was a fan. But
Believe it or not, they're sold on eBay even now.
Wow.
I do believe it, but it was Richie Victor, and he was quite a character.
But you know what? That happened in a lot of places. I know that story is very famous about them. They were trying to make money out of it. But it happened in a lot of places where they stayed. And in my book, that girl I mentioned I talked to, she said that her dad cut up all their sheets, but instead of selling them, he gave them away to all the fans that were waiting outside the hotel.
Nice.
So, yeah. So if anybody out there has got one of them bits of their sheets from the Sahara Inn Hotel, you know my email. I want one. You know, in terms of the Beatles in Chicago, I think the thing I want my book to really sort of emphasize is the point about how so many people, you know, love the Beatles. They were just, it was a phenomenon really. And I think the reason why they were so popular in '64 is because it was kind of like a shock, you know, that people in America just hadn't seen this, you know, while in England, they kind of rose quite gradually. You know, they had a song out in October '62, Love Me Do, and it kind of got sort of low reaches of the charts. Then Please Please Me got to #1 in some charts. And it really wasn't until the summer of '63 with She Loves You that they really became, you know, a really #1 band in England. And I think really it wasn't until the end of '63 that they became household names, because that's when they appeared on at the Palladium and at the Royal Variety show of the Queen Mother. So it was a kind of like a gradual thing. And also people in England did have longer hair because national service ended in England, so people could grow their hair. And there was a lot of people over there who were kind of like mods, which is like a youth cult. And they were kind of against the people that greased their hair back. So therefore, I think people in America, it was a shock. You know, when they came here in February '64, people they weren't prepared for it really. And I think that's why, in many ways, I think they became probably more popular in America than they did in the UK because of that shock value. Now, again, I know some people say about the Kennedy assassination that played a role in their popularity. I'm not convinced by that, but certainly people did, you know, they felt better about themselves because of the Beatles in February, March '64 than they did about themselves in, you know, December.
And thank you so very much, John.
Well, thank you, Bob. And thank you, everybody.
So, Mike.